Now, to try and get a kind of historical perspective of what's happened, I'd ask you to indulge me in a little thought experiment. Let's imagine that the Third Reich, Hitler's Third Reich, was not defeated on the battlefield in 1945. Maybe that the Second World War never happened, and that Hitler did not die by committing suicide in the bunker in Berlin in 1945. Let's imagine that that great totalitarian empire of the Third Reich continued for decades. Maybe Hitler would die in 1953, just as Stalin did, and maybe he'd be succeeded by a kind of reformer, someone like a German Khrushchev, who would perhaps tell the truth about the Holocaust and would admit that terrible things had been done in the 30s and 1940s. And then imagine that this reformer is pushed out of the way after a few years because the system can't really tolerate reform, and the Third Reich enters into a long period of stagnation under a kind of German Brezhnev. And it gradually runs out of steam. Nobody really believes in Nazism anymore. The Nazi model of economics doesn't really work, and the system gradually decays, and perhaps the coal price falls very deeply and to a very low level, and the Third Reich finally collapses, perhaps with a reform Nazi, a Mikhail Gorbach, for example, presiding as trying to reform the system and finding that as soon as you reform it, it collapses. So that takes us up to 1990-91, and then imagine that a new country takes shape, a German federation. Imagine that those countries that had been wiped off the map of the world in 1939 and 1940, like Holland and Denmark and Poland and Czechoslovakia, they come back, they regain their independence, and we're all pleased about that, just as we're pleased that Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania have regained their independence now. But imagine, and I think quite plausibly, we would mainly worry about this new thing, the German Federation, and we'd say we've got to make a go of this. And we might lend it quite a lot of money, and quite a lot would be stolen, because that's just what happened with Russia in the 1990s. And they might elect an embarrassing drunk as their president for 10 years, and a lot of things would be stolen. It would all be very chaotic and unsatisfactory, and that would be pretty much like the Russian Federation in the 1990s. And so we might be quite relieved with this German Federation, this post-Nazi German Federation, where the SS and the Gestapo haven't really been closed down, but they've been chopped up and relabelled, and where the Nazi party survives, but as a kind of fringe party, nobody takes it seriously anymore. We might be quite relieved in 1999 when a former SS colonel called Waldemar Pushnik becomes Prime Minister and then becomes President. And we might think, well, stability is pretty important, and the main thing is we don't want this German Federation to be a mess. And some of us might feel quite queasy about that, because we would remember that the SS had actually been a pretty bad organisation in the 1930s and 40s and killed quite a few million people. And then we'd say, well, on the other hand, Colonel Pushnik's a different generation. I mean, he was just a small kid when the Holocaust was happening. We can't really hold him. It wouldn't be right to hold modern-day Germans accountable for the crimes of the Hitler era, any more than it'd be right to hold modern-day Russians accountable for the crimes of the Stalin era. And so we might think that Colonel Pushnik was probably the best of a bad job. And we might be right to think that. But then imagine that Colonel Pushnik starts saying that the Anschluss, the incorporation of Austria into the Third Reich, was legal. Imagine that he starts saying that the Munich Agreement, which dismembered Czechoslovakia, was legal. Imagine that he says that the incorporation of Holland and Denmark into the Third Reich was legal. We might feel pretty nauseated about that. We might feel pretty uneasy. And that's exactly what Putin has done with his repeated assertion that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was legal. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that shameful deal between Stalin and Hitler, which was the death sentence for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland, which chopped up, in a cynical carve-up, chopped up Eastern Europe between two dictators. So we might be pretty uneasy about that. But then imagine how we would feel if we read in an official German government newspaper that there'd be no gas chambers at Auschwitz, if Holocaust denial became acceptable in this putative German Federation. Because that's what we've got in Russia now. Rossiyskaya Gazeta, an official Russian government newspaper, said in September the 17th last year that the murder of 20,000 Polish officers at Katyn in cold blood had not been done by the Nazis, had not been done by the NKVD, as every scrap of forensic and archival evidence shows, but had actually been done by the Nazis. That was the classic Stalinist combination, first the crime and then the lie. It was enforced at gunpoint through Eastern Europe through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s. I remember as a student in communist Poland being told by my teacher at university that I shouldn't believe the Western propaganda. It was actually the Nazis that killed those officers at Katyn. She had to tell me that because she'd lose her job otherwise. It was a condition of being a teacher in Poland that you had to sign up to that version of history. And it's not just one occasion. On 3 more occasions since the book went to press, it's been in Komsomolskaya Pravda, the main mass-market tabloid. It's been on TV Center, one of the big television channels owned and run by the Moscow municipality. Perhaps most shamefully of all, it's been in Nezavismaya Gazeta, once the most respectable of the Russian broadsheets, and not a squeak out of the Kremlin to contradict it. So that's pretty sinister.